Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Serene Prince. I'm the founder and president of Antigua and Barbuda Holistic Coalition. This is our third live, and we are joined by two wonderful people, which I'm going to talk about very soon, Dr. Natasha Lightfoot and Dr. Chanel Joseph. Just want to just briefly share why I wanted to do this particular live, because a lot of times we are talking about stigmas, Black mental health stigmas in the community of both in the US as well as in Antigua and Barbuda. And we oftentimes focus on the what and not the why. And I think it's very key to explore the why so that we can sort of dissociate with the stigmas and knowing that it's not ours and that we have the power to dismantle the myths as well as disconnect from the stigmas so that we can embrace holistically care, healthcare, mental health care, medical care. It's also important to look at history. I think a lot of times when we talk about healthcare, that we do not look at history, that we do not associate education with mental health or medical health, and they really to join, and they're really important simultaneously. And so that's why I invited these two persons with me today. So we have Dr. Natasha Lightfoot is an associate professor in the Department of History and a faculty fellow in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. Dr. Lightfoot was born in New York City to Antiguan parents. Dr. Lightfoot received a bachelor's in history from Yale and a master's and PhD in history from NYU. Dr. Lightfoot's research and teaching interests include Atlantic slavery and emancipation, Black community formation and acts of resistance, and daily practices of freedom in the 19th century British Caribbean. Dr. Lightfoot published Troubling Freedom, Antigua and the Aftermath of British Emancipation with Duke University Press in 2015. I have a copy of the book, by the way, and it is about Black working people's struggles and everyday forms of liberation in British colonial Antigua after slavery's end. Dr. Lightfoot has been published in the New York Times and numerous academic journals, including Slavery and Abolition and Small Acts, Caribbean Journal of Criticism. Dr. Lightfoot is currently writing a book titled Fugitive Cosmopolitans about enslaved people's mobility, imperial subjecthood, and struggles for freedom between empires in the Caribbean. Welcome, Dr. Lightfoot.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be a part of the conversation today.
Awesome. Did I miss anything?
Oh, you got it all. Thank you very much for that introduction.
Awesome. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Chanel C. Joseph, who hails from Antigua and Barbuda. Dr. Joseph is the owner of C. Joseph Medicine and Psychiatry. Joseph is a diplomat of both the American Board of Internal Medicine as well as the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. Dr. Joseph is certified in electroconvulsive therapy for the management of treatment resistant psychiatric conditions and use of imagery in the management of carotid, sorry, I think I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, and peripheral vascular, thyroid, cardiac, and respiratory conditions. Dr. Joseph specializes in psychiatry and neurology. Dr. Joseph holds a degree in Bachelor's in Science and Honors at Dalhousie University, and she graduated cum laude MD at American University of Antigua, sorry. Dr. Joseph is also an author of several publications in the American Journal Case Reports. Welcome, Dr. Joseph. Did I miss anything?
No, you did not. We'll leave it there. That's enough.
Okay, so I think we could just like jump right into it. I will occasionally show a few questions from our viewers this afternoon who may have a few questions. So I'll pop them on the screen. I know we have a lot of information. We're trying to pack it in. We would love to make this 2 hours, but everyone, the viewers, your donation is key. These two experts, these two women are donating their time. So I just want you to know that they are really condensing a lot of information that we can actually put into two-part series. Yeah. But we are going to try to hit a lot of the key points. We want to make this as interactive as possible while paying attention to time. So, Dr. Lightfoot, can you share with us the history of mental illness during slavery and abolition?
So first, I just wanted to ask how much time should I spend? Because I could go on. You did mention being attentive, so I just
I
want to
would
know.
say I would say probably about 15 minutes. Is that enough?
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
that's enough.
Okay.
That's more than enough, actually.
Okay.
So as mentioned by Serene in her lovely introduction, I've researched on the history of slavery and freedom in Antigua, obviously with reference to Barbuda and other islands as well in the British Caribbean, and so much of the story of what is the history of mental illness in slavery and in the abolition period is pretty much layered onto what is the personal kind of social experience of slavery and abolition for all of the hundreds of thousands of Black people imported forcibly from West Africa through the slave trade into the Caribbean region. Every single stage of this history was laced with mental trauma. We can start with all of the different ways that people were captured from the West African coast. So many people had no idea exactly what was laying ahead for them on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And so, as a historian, many of the works that I've read by other historians, as well as the historical records from slave traders, from plantation owners, et cetera, government officials, have all made reference to the ways that the people who arrived on slave ships came malnourished. Many of them had seen lots of death and also degradation on the way. People are being torn from their kin networks, from the only places that they know, being basically handcuffed together like livestock and placed on these ships. They are not given proper nourishment. They are just basically kept alive so that they can be then readied for sale on this side of the world when they reach. They spend sometimes anywhere from 3 months or so waiting to be shipped once they get captured in these slave forts that still dot the coastline of different African nations facing the Atlantic Ocean. So those dungeons show the marks of all kinds of horrors. People were sitting in their own bodily fluid, their own excrement. People might be, and they might also be tied with someone who actually may have passed away and they may have witnessed that and they did not get to do anything to properly attend to the dead. It would take for a slave trader to notice that somebody had died. People were, women especially were subject to sexual violence, which is also a form of trauma, deep, deep trauma. Many women would end up pregnant as well on the voyage, and imagine being pregnant or sometimes giving birth on slave ships. And this is all before you get to the Caribbean region itself. And the kinds of horrors again that are already being staged on the ocean
You know,
are
um,
repeated on the land.
Dr. Lightfoot and Dr.
Mhm.
Joseph, I I had planned to do a breathing exercise before we went into it, and I
Mm,
completely forgot about that. And the
mm,
reason being is because And so I apologize for those that are listening, because I think it's really important to understand that when we are engaged in this conversation, even though we are aware of it, you've studied it, right? It's your life's work, that it's still impactful. And I know that Dr. Joseph will touch on that, and collectively we'll talk about that, but how it can just maybe inherently trigger some discomfort.
Yeah.
And so for those that are listening, we want you to know that we are mindful of that, and that you don't have to listen to this right now. You can listen to it later on. And you can also share with us any emotions that you're experiencing, right? And we
Mhm.
can pause just a little bit, because this is a lot of information and it does involve some painful history, and probably some things that resonates with us in present day. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you, Dr. Life, for continue. Sorry.
Okay, not to worry. If you do want to actually do the breathing exercise, maybe at the end of my remarks, certainly, that I would be very much welcoming to something like that, because even though, as you said, it is my life's work, it is difficult to do as well. And I also have to be mindful of the times that this becomes heavy, a very heavy load to bear. The knowledge that I have, I do want to share with everybody, but it is hard once you know about this. You Once you learn and become much more steeped in the knowledge of what happened to our ancestors, you look at the world entirely differently. And you especially look at what's happening with Black people in our region, in the world today. You know, you just have a whole different perspective on how much what we're suffering today does not come out of anywhere. It just is deeply grounded in a longer term history of systematic Black degradation. So, as I was saying, before we took that moment, the sorts of horrors that took place aboard slave ships would be repeated in different ways on the land. So, first of all, the Atlantic slave trade in general is said to have been estimated at something like 12 million Africans stolen from West Africa into the Americas. The largest receiving port was Brazil, but then the next largest receiving port after that was the Caribbean. And of the 12.5 million that came on board ships, the estimates are that only between 9.5 to 10 million people survived the journey. So there are 2 million dead bodies that are in a trail from Africa through the Americas on the bottom of the ocean. Again, that's mental trauma right there. Just every single dead person in the Atlantic, man, woman, and child, somebody witnessed that death. That death may have come on the coast. That death may have come on the ship. That death may have come at the shores of the Caribbean. Either way, those are all harms that people took with them. When they arrived in the Caribbean, enslaved people were put on auction blocks in full nakedness so that people who were assessing them for sale could see how physically ready they were to do that hard work that was expected of them in the cane fields. They would assess women's bodies for fertility. And, certainly women who were already pregnant or nursing would be seen as, sort of a double investment, where you get two enslaved people for the price of one. Many people would also sell family members and friends and kin apart. So there was never really a guarantee that who you came on the ship with, whether you knew them before, you had formed bonds with them on the ocean, that where you and they were going would be the same place. So you're constantly having to recreate family and community ties when you're moving from plantation to plantation. And there are multiple instances This was a regular feature in the history of slavery in the Caribbean and throughout the Americas. People would be sold because they were just like any other asset you might claim today. So, the same way you might own a piece of land, you might own your house, those kinds of, you might own a business. Those kinds of assets, enslaved people were equal to those. And so, an enslaved person could be put up as collateral for a loan. An enslaved person could be willed when someone passed away. An enslaved person could be gifted to someone else, like on the occasion of a wedding or a birthday. And so you'll see these sorts of discourses in the literature where slave owners would try to say things like, we're just like a family, where the slave master is the patriarch at the head of the family and the slaves are like his children. But the family is full of violence. Getting people to work every day on plantations was a matter of force, brute force, and again, more trauma. Every single act of productivity was done at the edge of a whip. So, getting people to wake up in the morning, and report to the fields as soon as the sun rose and stay in the fields until the sun set. And then when it's harvest season and the canes have to be, converted in the mills to rum, molasses, and sugar, which were the kind of like trifecta of the productivity that was basically dominating plantation society in the Caribbean. At harvest time, people would work at night too, in the mills, grinding and rolling canes through these big rollers by hand. And sometimes people would lose limbs in the rollers. Sometimes people would be crushed in the rollers. Other enslaved people working alongside these people would witness this. Every single time that enslaved people tried to fight back, and they did, outside of the Haitian Revolution, which we know was the only successful slave revolt in that it was able to get rid of colonial masters and slavery all at once and declare the independent state of Haiti and a freedom for all Black people. That's the only success. Every other uprising was one where Black people were punished once they were found out and it failed. And you can learn from that failure that Black people wanted to be free. But that failure also would result in more violence.
Dr. Lightfoot, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I think I may have read it in your book, and you can let me know if I'm correct, that in Barbuda, that chattel slavery, where they would match a woman slave and a male slave that both looked strong and took them to Barbuda to, and I'm using the word breed because that's what was
Mm-hmm.
documented.
Mm-hmm.
Am I correct in that information that Barbuda?
So Barbuda was seen as Barbuda has always been rumored to have been a slave breeding ground. And I talk about this in the book because ultimately what I want people to understand is that no matter where enslaved people were sent to, they were expected to reproduce. They were expected to breed. The bigger issue is that in Barbuda, because of its actual topography, like Barbuda, if you've ever seen it, when you even when you arrive on it by boat, you can barely see it until you're up on it because the topsoil is so thin and it's just barely above sea level. That is not a soil that can support the mass production of sugarcane because those who have any sort of agricultural knowledge would know that sugarcane planting is very much depleting to the soil. And so you had to like rotate the cane pieces that you would actually on a plantation. You couldn't just keep planting the same piece of land over and over again even. So that's why plantations are such large swaths of land, because you have to rotate between different sets of grounds where some are just planted, some are shoots coming out, and some are ready to be harvested at any given point in the year. And in Barbuda, that did not happen. It is documented fully in a lot of the literature of Caribbean slavery that planting and cutting cane killed Black people. Most sugar producing islands had a negative birth rate, which means that no one could carry enough pregnancies to term and that infants could be, healthy at birth to create a natural increase in the population. The only way that Caribbean populations on sugar islands would increase is through slave import. And the literature says that ultimately planters knew that it was cheaper to work a slave to death and buy a new one than it was to feed a slave and properly clothe a slave and provide for a slave till their old age healthily. And so, with that in mind, in Barbuda, because there's no sugarcane planting, there's actually healthier enslaved people. And so Barbuda had a positive birth rate throughout all of slavery. And that's something that, distinguishes Barbuda and does suggest that the breeding was quote unquote successful. But anywhere that masters owned slaves, they expected those slaves to produce and they would not give them a choice of mate all the time. They might just say, you and you go, you're going to go together and produce some new enslaved people. This There's so much to say, and I just got the notice that there's 3 minutes left. I didn't even get to freedom yet. But the point being, every single facet of the experience that I'm describing to you, the people who have the right, the sort of privilege to write, the people who have knowledge, the people who went to school, who had access to pen and paper to leave behind these records are mostly white people. So they're going to write what they see from their perspective. And there's multiple mentions in the records of Caribbean slavery and freedom of people, of Black people going mad, quote unquote. Madness is constantly a feature of the description of Black people. Not everyone in every case, but the point is, it's not unheard of to see enslaved people and freedom after freedom, early populations of freed people being described as, some of them going mad, some of them not understanding, some of them just, sort of having trouble taking on what is being asked of them.
Yeah.
And
I
those kinds of things I think are the sort of the best indications we have that mental illness was a signal feature of the history of slavery. I mean, again, look at what we're describing here. Everything that I'm talking about, every single part of it is traumatic. So of course
and
there's
it's important, we'll get into it, that it was weaponized against us
hmm
in the face of seeking freedom.
yes, yes.
And so we'll get into that. Just want to take a deep inhale, because that was a lot. And I appreciate you sharing that abundance of information all in a matter of 20 minutes. I think less than that.
Yeah, I have a lot more I could say, but let's leave it for maybe question and answer and
Yes.
what happens with, Dr. Joseph's remarks, etc. So,
Yes. And I would love to get into it, but I want to respect you all time.
yeah, yeah.
And we're going to get back to that.
Okay.
Dr. Joseph.
So, good afternoon again. I chose to combine the history of mental health in Antigua in terms of how it developed through slavery, and I added information about where mental health is in Antigua now. And I'm glad I did because that would sort of cut down on time. So I hope you guys find this information helpful. If I go too fast, you can ask any questions. So, in researching about mental health in Antigua and Barbuda, it's very much similar throughout the Caribbean. And so I found one very beautifully written article. It was written based on the history, specifically in Jamaica, but it did mention the other islands. And you have to go back to slavery, which is what we're talking about here. So most islands were captured in the mid 17th century, And as Dr. Lightfoot was giving us in great detail, there was a high incidence of mental illness at that time. So, in response to all the traumatic things Dr. Lightfoot was just talking about, some slaves in defiance would commit suicide.
Yeah.
And the article mentioned suicide by hanging or by eating dirt. There was also organized suicides where individuals, 25 or more, would commit suicide. This is in defiance of being captured and enslaved. And as Dr. Lightfoot was speaking of in great detail, a lot of slaves developed mental illness just traveling from Africa, whether it's to Brazil or to the Caribbean, just based on all that you were explaining. The mental health facilities that were developed to address this was provided by the British, but as Dr. Lightfoot rightly said, the violence continued once they got off the ship. So there was lots of use of restraints. If you were defiant in being a slave, that was used as a definition that you're mentally ill, that you did not want to be a slave. And sometimes that punishment can mean death, especially if your defiance gets violent. They would end your life. One of those forms was by slowly burning you to death. There are people within the slave community that recognized that mental illness was becoming an issue. So some of the doctors in the slaves, some of the preachers who were slaves, and some Obia men took it upon themselves to try to provide some form of mental treatment. So on the next slide, I'll speak about emancipation of slavery. That did not help in managing mental illness. There was an increased need of addressing the mental illness that would have developed all this time. But even the services that were being provided lagged behind what was existing in Britain at the time. As I said, people who were revolting against slavery, it was one of the definitions that you're mentally ill, and they responded by increasing the military. And anybody who was captured to be resisting being a slave would be institutionalized. So you would be locked away in, these would be the original or the first mental health facilities. Nobody wants to be enslaved, so the number of people being put away increased over time. And so, to accommodate the volumes, this is where large, very secure asylums were built to house the lunatics. These are the people that would try to get away from slavery. Now, in my reading, I found that an asylum was actually built in Antigua, and this was to house individuals coming from the Leeward Islands. Another one was put in Grenada, and this is to house people who would be sent from the Windward Islands. And most of the treatments here was restraint, so you were essentially being held against your will.
Mhm.
Now, I placed a little excerpt from the article that I read about the mental health facilities, the asylums at that time. And I specifically did this to contrast with where we are now. So the asylums, even at that time, weren't well kept. They were overcrowded. Let's say they were supposed to house a maximum of 100. You had 200 to 300 people being there. Staffing was next to none. The staff they had were not well trained. There were no rehabilitation programs. You were essentially just put somewhere without any follow through. And so in the mid 1930s, the lunatic asylums were then reassigned or relabeled as mental hospitals. And these mental hospitals were given names, and the names were designed to give you a sense of calmness, that it's a wellness center, if you will. And so on the next slide, there's a list of the names that were given to the asylums, now mental hospitals in various countries. A lot of them had the view part in the name. So in Belize, it was Sea View. In Jamaica, it's Bellevue. In Antigua, it was and still is Clearview. At that time, they had different treatments that were being introduced coming through in studies. The electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, is one of them. They used to use insulin to try to induce a coma. They also did lobotomies where they deliberately damaged the frontal lobe of the brain. And the medications that were being used was the phenothiazine. And in contrast with today, Modicate is an injection that is a phenothiazine. It's given every 2 weeks at Clearview to certain clients to this very day. And so there are things that would have been put in place back in the early 1900s that still carries through even in 2023.
100 years later.
Oh
And
God.
so, yes,
I'm sorry. And I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm just
yeah,
That's
it's an uncomfortable, it's an uncomfortable, upsetting laugh.
yeah.
So on the next slide, I have put some pictures just to demonstrate what's involved with the electroconvulsive therapy. It has advanced over time. Now, in modern times, it's still being used to treat mental health conditions that's not responding to medication, to counseling. And what it is, you'll see the two probes over the temple. They would deliver a short burst of electricity. The leads that you see on the head, they're literally placed all over. They monitor your brain waves. There's a bite block to prevent you from damaging your teeth. Anesthesia is involved. It's a very controlled treatment, but it was very barbaric when it first came out. Um, it's not something I'm aware of that's available in most Caribbean countries. It's not available in Antigua. I don't know that we're going to get there in my career, just based on where mental health is at.
I just want to
Lobotomy,
add that I do have patients that have undergone ECT, and it's very
mhm,
intensive, and there's a lot of therapy involved, and it has
yes,
been effective for those that are maybe cringing at it. But go ahead.
yes. So it does work. It's one of the, believe it or not, if you have depression in pregnancy, ECT is safer than an antidepressant. It has very little risk to the fetus. And I know some people are like, well, that doesn't make sense, but it's the preferred treatment. The picture on the right is just demonstrating what would have happened in lobotomies. They don't do those anymore. But picture an ice pick going into your nose, and they will hit it until they get to your frontal lobe, which is in your forehead area, and sort of just twist it around, trying to damage the area. So these are some of the treatments that would have come out back in the early 1900s. Now, on the next slide, I put a little excerpt from Antigua specifically, and this just talks about the creation of the asylum here in 1841. It housed 80 people maximum, and because of the increased need, they then developed the mental hospital, which currently has a capacity of 130 people. The other thing I wanted to mention, I put back that insert that I had placed before. And unfortunately, the description of the asylum back in the late 1800s describes exactly what our current mental health hospital is. Clearview Psychiatric Hospital is in dire need of repair. I think I overheard sometime last year one of the buildings was being condemned, and so they were moving the residents from that building into other buildings which were already over capacity. The individuals who live at Clearview, you get medications and you're just in a room or on a bed. There's very little programs, training. I think there's a social worker. There may be some counseling, but one social worker for 130 people, you're not going to be having interaction that's going to make a significant impact in your mental health. Last year and even in 2021, staff at the hospital were protesting. They didn't have the equipment to do their jobs, things like kitchenware, food, toiletries. weren't being provided. At one point, there were no functioning toilets at Clearview, and they had to do a makeshift pit essentially to house the waste of people who were residing there. And so I hope it has come across that how these things developed, but in Antigua we haven't really made any advancement.
Mm.
I'll speak a little bit about the mental health laws. So throughout the Caribbean, the mental health laws were developed based on the British colonial government at that time. The laws were centered around long term care. So if you're identified as having mental illness, you were admitted to a facility to stay there. They deem you unable to do basic things such as eating, bathing, clothing. And so you're put there, and somebody is to help you with these things in addition to medication. And so if you skip ahead a few slides, I put some excerpts from our mental health laws. And so on the next slide, you'll see that the mental health or the Mental Health Treatment Act of Antigua is dated October 1st, 1957. There have been no updates since then. And I took little snippets from it to show you what was the terminology at that time, so 1957. And since we haven't changed it, this is what we're still working under in 2023. So on the next slide, and if you just read the first two words under A, B, C, D there, you'll see that individuals with mental illness are being referred to as insane, or you're an epileptic, you're an idiot, you're an imbecile, you're feeble minded. These are terms that maybe would have been applicable at that time, but mental health has advanced significantly. Yet these are the terms in our laws in 2023. The other excerpt that I took, so in the next slide, it talks about the discontinuation of words such as asylum or lunatic.
Mm.
Yet, in the Medical Benefits Act, mental health is being referred to by law as certified lunacy, even as of today in 2023. I know this because they were advising me that I would have to write certified lunacy on a claims form, and I absolutely refused.
Mm.
I wrote a very strongly worded document to the head of medical benefits. They pretty much told me it's in the law and the law would have to be changed, but there is no movement to do that. And so, yes, dear, go ahead.
I know we're short for time, but I just it is blowing my. Okay, so in the context of being licensed clinicians,
Mm-hmm.
we would, not can, we would lose our license or have our license suspended if we ever wrote such a thing on any client's documents. They would
Mm-hmm.
be like, revoke that person's license.
Yeah,
In the
So
United States.
in the United
I'm sued. I'm sued.
I but go
Yeah.
ahead. Sorry.
So I just have two slides left. On the next slide, I wanted to talk about other advancements in mental health. There's way more than this in places like the US, UK, Canada. But these are just some things that have been demonstrated in the Caribbean, especially in Jamaica and Trinidad, that we have had little or none of here in Antigua. So I think it was Dr. Matrine that would have implemented community mental health clinics at various clinics throughout the island. I believe that those clinics are supposed to offer mental health services, but I get a lot of calls from clients who say they call the clinic and there's never an option there. There's no schedule. They have no idea when to go specifically to deal with a mental health issue.
Mm.
In 2023, Most hospitals that have been built within the last 100 years has a psychiatric unit within the medical hospital. It's very rarely a separate facility to hide away behind trees and walls. They've recognized that mental health is a part of health,
Mm-hmm.
and so just like you have the intensive care unit, the psychiatric unit is within the hospital. We do not have that here, and that's for multiple reasons, including the Sir Lester Bird Medical Center was not built or designed with that in mind.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the outpatient mental health services in Antigua are through private providers. And one of the common complaints that I get, even though my prices I think are pretty reasonable, is that people can't afford it. And so you would need those options through the government as a more cost effective option, but there's very little available. The other thing that I do not think has ever been here is rehabilitation. Even in 2023, individuals that admitted to Clearview, they very rarely leave. And so you have people living there, but there is no rehabilitation, whether it's occupational therapy, learning how to manage money, clean a home, prepare a meal, or vocational rehab. In other countries, they've realized that individuals with mental illness can get a job, they can work. But in Antigua, if you've had any mental illness, the employers look at you as if, well, we don't want you. And so there needs to be that put in place. In islands that have put some of these things in place, they saw a reduction in hospital admission, sometimes 50, 60%. Of the people who were admitted, more than half were actually discharged home. They weren't just living in the hospital. I think in Jamaica it was high as 80%. Readmission rates were still high, but that had to do with multiple issues, including follow up after you're getting discharged, compliance with medication, but there were some benefits to implementing some of these measures. And so on my last slide, I just put what I believe to be the bare minimum we need to put in place to be able to say that we have a proper mental health system in Antigua. We need a proper, secure, humane mental health facility. We need updated, cost effective medication options. Unfortunately, most of my patients have to go to the private pharmacies for their medications.
Mm.
Very little modern medications are available through medical benefits, and even what's provided at the private pharmacies are a little outdated. There are medications I used in the United States that I haven't even thought of in the year and a half I've been here. We need proper mental health laws because as a psychiatrist, I've never certified a lunatic and I refuse to throughout my career. We need accessible, cost-effective counseling options. Most of the psychotherapy in Antigua is being provided privately at a cost, and we need therapies in place so people can, after treatment, get back into being functional in society, be able to pay their bills, manage their bank account, drive, have a job. And so, if any of these things concern you, if there's any of these you would like to see, what I encourage people is to reach out to the Ministry of Health and advocate for what you would need regarding whether it's your mental health, somebody you know, or if you just want to see Antigua advance from the early 1900s that we seem to be stuck in regarding mental health. So this is my little blurb. I hope the information was helpful. I hope it brought some insight. And if there's anything I rushed through, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I think we have. Oh, so I want to thank you both because I know like you were just packing it all in, right? And we have 10, 15 minutes, depending on how much time you have. I have a lot of time today. Um, we have some few things here. Oh, Auntie Valerie says good afternoon. And Abigail Valentine gives us claps, 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 claps. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Um, There is so much to talk about and unpack about everything that you said. I know, Dr. Lightfoot, you shared an article that you found here. Um, Before we get to that, I just want to, for us to just sort of make the connection again. And I think we already did between Black mental health stigmas and slavery. And as Dr. Lightfoot and Dr. Joseph, you shared about the history surrounding the atrocities done to Africans and Black African Caribbeans, Afro Caribbeans, for hundreds of years. We're not talking about that this happened for a span of 50 years. Dr. Lightfoot, I want you to share with us how many hundreds of years this was happening.
So the slave trade that the British engaged in probably started in somewhere around the top of the 1600s. So we're talking about 1600 to 1807, which is when the slave trade ended, but slavery itself doesn't end until 1834. So we're talking 200 plus almost 250 years of enslavement in the British held Caribbean, in Antigua, and throughout the region. And so that is a significant amount of time where Black people were deemed property and were seen as mentally ill, as Dr. Joseph noted, for wanting to be free. So that already is a very long head start in affiliating Blackness with mental deficiency.
Yes. And both of you can share. So, about how many generations are we talking about?
Depends on how you define a generation, because this is another part of the trauma of slavery. Really, to be honest, we're talking about how, if we talk about a generation now, a generation might be seen as, like, say, 20 to 30 years. It's usually a kind of acceptable amount of time between mother and father and child. But
Mm-hmm.
in the context of slavery, women were not, were seen as old by the time they were 40. It was a miracle that they lived to that long. And that and children, literal teenage girls, were seen as already of quote unquote breeding age. So it was not really unheard of for a girl to have been impregnated by the time she was 13, 14, 15. So generations are actually quite compressed. And so if you think about a generation, instead of being about 20 to 30 years, being more like, 15 years, we're looking at, something like maybe a good, 30 to 40 generations of enslaved people living through these traumas of witnessing things like what Dr. Joseph also included in her bullet points, defiance being punished with public violence, because that's also a certain type of discipline. If
Mm-hmm.
you, as a witness to this person or person's attempt to try to free themselves and their family, you see them ending up on at the stake burning or hanging on a tree, that all amounts to a certain type of violence you then take with you, that is impressed upon you, that you then have to find a way to bury inside to be able to show up to the field next day.
Right. And Dr. Joseph, feel free to add anything. Oh, we have a comment from Siobhan Carr. Hey, God sister. That's the cousin of Dr. Lightfoot. So
That me too.
Siobhan, so
A lot of
Siobhan,
cousins on this chat today.
Siobhan writes, I would like to commend you all on the knowledge you shared with us. This platform is a step forward into reducing the stigma of mental health. Big up Antigua, women in charge. Yes, 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 I. So, I just, because I'm trying to like throw bullet points. So these things are coming up for me. I think about culture. I think about Antigua and Barbuda. I think about that we just got into a place where persons are looking forward to getting a medical exam some of the time. But when we talk about slavery, and that if you presented with menstruation, that means you were going to get raped. So you had to hide your menstrual cycle. So now we have generations of people who are not talking on menstruation or menopause because either you were going to get raped, menopause mean you were no good. Don't talk about it, right? Then that creates a lot of oppressing, no knowledge, not seeking support. When we talk about men were also raped, right? So we talk about emasculation. So when we talk about the harms that are oftentimes done to women, um, that too, they were forced to rape their family members, so ancestral rape. And then they were being raped by, and I don't like to use their masters, their or slave owners, but their slave owners. So they were raped by their male slave owners. They were forced to have ancestral sex to conceive a child that would be taken away from them, who likely would have had a cognitive disability because it was intergenerational. Am I correct, Dr. Joseph? Okay.
Yeah,
So,
the probability would be high.
and they would be hanged, right? So there's a lot of don't say, hide, 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 right? And that in itself creates mental illness. It creates generalized anxiety disorder, which plagues the Black community a lot, especially in Antigua and Barbuda. There's a lot of GAD, and I want everyone to know that GAD is different from social anxiety. Anxiety, they are not the same. Okay, so I'm throwing all of this because I want everyone to understand that mental stigmas is not ours, and that unfortunately, even in the US, there is still a colonial delivery of healthcare, which many of us are working to decolonialize. Even when we talk about Dr. Lightfoot, the studies and the research that she shares is very pertinent to the work that we do. So I just want everyone to understand the value of all of this and the work that Dr. Joseph is doing and has a lot of knowledge and certifications that aren't not able to avail themselves in Antigua Barbuda because of the changes that need to be made in Antigua and Barbuda. And so this is an opportunity for persons to not feel as though that we are poo-pooing on them, coming down on them, but to really look at how these laws are sort of fueling colonial styles and oppressive ways of treatment. And I know Dr. Joseph has to go. So, Dr. Joseph, is there anything that you want to end and share with us? As I know you have to leave.
I just want to thank you for inviting me to do this. In preparing for it, I learned quite a bit. I can definitely see where the mentality that we have about mental health, where it comes from and how it's holding us back, and not just in mental health care or physical health care, but even just our day to day, our interactions with each other, our success levels. And so I'm hoping that by learning where this stemmed from, we can now develop ways to rise above it. I would like to see Antigua get to the place where we are advancing in healthcare. And across the globe, mental health is always at the bottom of the list when you're breaking down healthcare. But in Antigua, if it's at the bottom, it doesn't even seem to be on the list. And so I'd like to see as healthcare advance, we're doing transplants here. I don't see how we've gotten to transplants, but basic mental health care we do not offer. And so I try to do these talks to encourage people to know about mental health, that it's something that you can get help with, um, and that the more people are talking about it, get comfortable with it, we get to the point where we advocate for what we need, what we deserve as a people. People shouldn't have to take sick leave just because they're mentally exhausted. And even if I fill out the sick leave for mental health issues, it's usually a hiccup. But if I put it for a physical issue, it's not a problem. So we need to get past the stigma. Part of that is learning the history. And I
Mm.
hope people who are listening will do their own research, educate themselves, and teach others, spread the information. Don't just keep it to yourself so that we can advance as a country, as a people.
Yeah. And I know you're going to go, but I want to share with people why I asked for donations. This is an organization. I want you to understand that what you are listening to today is worth more than 1,000 US. I'm sorry. I have to let people understand that a discussion, a webinar, a psychoeducational discussion that we're having today, such as this, it costs money. These women are donating their time. They're not charging me. It ain't in the budget. But at some point, I need to start paying people to offer their expertise. And that's why I ask for donations. A lot of times people think that asking for donations, oh, you're just a look money. Da, da, da. Understand that the invoice is over $1,000 US. That is the level of information expertise that you're offering here, and it's probably 2,000. And I'm not trying to say that to be pompous. I just want you to understand the value of it. And so, Antigua and Barbuda Holistic Coalition is about bringing everything together so that you can take care of your entire self. Um, as my God sister shares here, right? If your mind is not well, you cannot take care of yourself and physically, medically. And that is true. So you may have ailments.
Very true.
Siobhan Carr is a nurse practitioner, by the way. So we have a lot of, things going on in the family. And she can tell you that someone who has an ailment, if they're not taking care of their mental health care, and Dr. Joker says as well, it exacerbates medical conditions and vice versa. And medical conditions like autoimmune diseases that I've worked with clients who've had it have been misdiagnosed with personality disorder, delusional thinking. And I discovered that this client has autoimmune, but that's just because I used to work in the hospital and had a lot of experience surrounding that. So I could pick up on that. But it's really important to engage in your total self. And as Dr. Joseph mentioned in Antigua, Barbuda, and everywhere, that you have to advocate for yourself. You have to say that you need this because the demand is much more powerful. If there's no demand, no one's putting money into it. Money matters. And so they have to know that there's a need in order to put money into it. Yes. So we want to empower everyone. Dr. Joseph, Dr. Lightfoot, I thank you. Dr. Lightfoot, I don't know if there's anything that you want to share. Dr. Joseph, I know you have to go. Is there anything that you want to end here with us before I tell everyone about my upcoming events?
I just wanted to say that I really am encouraged by how many people are in, the conversation today and wanting more knowledge, because a good portion of the